This is Ken Forster, Executive Director at Momenta. Welcome to our Digital Thread podcast, produced by, for, and about digital industry leaders. In this series of conversations, we capture insights from the best and brightest minds in digital industry. They're executives, entrepreneurs, advisors, and other thought leaders. What they have in common is, like our team at Momenta, they are deep industry operators. We hope you find these podcasts informative, and as always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Good day and welcome to episode 144 of our Momenta Digital Thread podcast series. Today, it's my great pleasure to host Rachel Taylor, CEO of Nubix, an edge-native application platform that makes it easy to build, deploy, and manage applications, even on the tiniest of edge devices for the industrial IoT. Momenta is actually a proud investor in Nubix. Now, Rachel is a passionate operational executive with more than 20 years of enterprise infrastructure technology experience. She has held numerous leadership roles at leading tech companies where she's helped build great teams to achieve operational excellence, as well as various liquidity events, including Cloudera, Meraki, Peakstream, Riverbed, and VMware. Prior to Nubix, Rachel was Chief Operating Officer at Rocana, focused on securing funding and scaling the organization. Rachel, welcome to our Digital Thread podcast.
Thanks, Ken. It's great to be here.
And it's great to have you. I always end up saying the same thing at the beginning of this. It's like, we should have done this a long time ago. And it certainly applies to you because we've been an investor for a while, and I know have worked with you on several different capacities. And I know how hard it is to get your time. So I really greatly do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. So as always, I always like to start this, to understand your own digital industry leadership journey. What would you consider to be your digital thread? In other words, the one or more thematic threads that define that journey.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings of late, the last couple of years, has become that life only makes sense in reverse. And maybe that's because I'm, now in my 40s and, life is starting to make more sense. But I think for me, starting off in tech, especially 20 some years ago as a woman, was really challenging, and there were a lot of roadblocks. But I navigated. I continued to tack. If you use the sailboat analogies, right? I just kept tacking and finding the wind and the current, and eventually I made my way back. But it's been a strange journey that now I absolutely am so grateful for kind of the turns that life gave me along my professional career that landed me here. So. And that really has been starting off in technology, right? Wrote my first program in second grade and was just hooked on technology. Went to college actually early. And, at the age of 16 was the first sales rep on campus for Apple for their HEP2 program. Got to go to the Irvine campus of Apple at 16, had to get a waiver signed, right, in college from my parents. Worked in the computer labs all through college, and then started my first job after graduating from college at 19 and ended up implementing the first Windows NT network in the state of California for a brokerage firm, where I really kind of solidified my love of technology for its practical ability to solve really, really hard, really important problems in meaningful ways. And then my journey kind of took a turn as I moved from San Diego up to the Bay Area. I thought I'd get a tech job and be a network admin, but instead I kind of got forced into technical recruiting and I built 5 or 6 NOCs for Exodus Communications before they blazed out. And then, like you mentioned, I went to some marquee technology companies really early and got to help them build those companies, with a great technology idea, some money from some VCs, and we got to go build the team and execute. So I had this kind of front row seat, right, over and over again to what that process looks like and seeing kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and firsthand, sat in a lot of boardrooms, presented to, Vinod Khosla and Doug Leone and, a whole host of the VC elite in Silicon Valley, and learned a lot about, how to build a great company and how to make a lot of great mistakes along the way and how to navigate that as part of Nubix's journey.
It's interesting. We have a well-known exec search practice, and so one of the first things I keyed in is the kind of the people leadership roles you did, both recruiting, key talent and certainly managing them. And it was interesting to hear you say you were kind of forced in that direction, because I think, man, what a lucky break early on to get that, because I know how, one, difficult it is to recruit people, but two, how empathetic it makes you toward understanding people and truly, I think, getting the most out of them. So I'm actually fascinated by this foot in, the technology and the talent acquisition space. I wanted to ask kind of what attracted you to that intersection. I think you said you were kind of forced into it, but, what were some of your key lessons learned out of that during that time?
What I learned is a couple of things. Is that, first of all, I always had a really great nose for early technology, right? So, I mean, I love to talk about the fact that I went to Riverbed before there was a WAN optimization Magic Quadrant with Gartner. I went to VMware before there was a virtualization Magic Quadrant, right? Like, Peakstream got acquired into Google to power their browser, right? At 20 people. I was at Meraki when it was 19 people and helped grow it to over 100, and still is the most successful acquisition Cisco's made. So great nose for tech, and tech that's meaningful, but also tier one. So what I learned is, first and foremost, go to the leader. Don't go to the tier two company. Go to the people that are absolutely top shelf all the way, right? So that's number one, is be the best. Don't be a follow-on. Don't be a second player. And they call that, the kings of category, right? So that I learned. The second was that A players are absolutely, like, you settle for nothing less. Again, that top shelf kind of attitude, right? Like, B players hire C players and build C player teams. A players, you get that multiplier effect of 10x, and that is massive. And the other thing about people that I learned is that you want missionaries, not mercenaries. Mercenaries will be gone the second something better comes along, $10,000 more, whatever it is, they'll be gone. You hire the people that are passionate both about what you're trying to solve, but also about what kind of culture and what kind of environment and what kind of leaders you're committed to having in that organization. And then the last thing I learned about people is that consistency is king, right? Just like kids, just like dogs, just like relationships of any kind, romantic or professional, you have to do the things you promise early on, or else you end up with either people that are disgruntled or apathetic and just check out, and in fact, maybe worse, are actively kind of negative influences in your organization, or you lose them, right? And then you end up in this kind of leaky sieve situation. So a great idea without the right people to execute is not going to reach the kind of success that the companies I've been at have reached. And then, I'd say that the last piece is that, always do the right thing with people. It'll always work out, right? Even if that means letting somebody go, even if that means, not promoting someone because you don't think it's the right choice. You have to be consistent to your values, because it impacts so many different pieces of your organization's potential and opportunity and bandwidth and overhead and how fast you can move. So it really has been kind of the most important thing that I learned on my journey to becoming a CEO, is the people side of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Again, I think you were lucky or blessed to have such an opportunity so early to have a foot in both, and we'll talk in a minute how you're applying that. I noticed, a very interesting, I'd say, kind of real step up on your CXO career. So you left, I guess, Cloudera and went with some of the execs to form Rocana in 2014, and took on the role of COO at that point. Just looking at the fundamentals, it looks like an incredible journey. You did a funding round 2015 led by Google Ventures. You exited to Splunk in 2017. Typical Silicon Valley kind of dream experience in such a short time. What did Rocana do, and what did you learn really as part of its leadership team so early?
Well, Well, Ken, again, it's funny not to be a broken record, but it's like everything ends up making sense in the end, right? Like I look at the companies I've been at, and WAN optimization actually has threads. In fact, somebody just said the other day how, some of the stuff we're doing at Nubix has flavors of Riverbed's WAN optimization piece, right? Of what we're doing on these edge devices. And then you have VMware, which is virtualization, which is, kind of the first version, right? Early Gen 1 of containers is virtual machines, right? And then you get to Cloudera, which is big data, which obviously is core to being able to collect data, build models, and build ML that then goes wherever it needs to go to be applied. And Rocana was kind of the last piece of that, which was what we were doing at Rocana was collecting all of the machine generated data in an infrastructure and IT infrastructure, right? So everything, your firewall and your routers and your servers and even your cooling systems, like anything that's inside of that cage or connected to your IT system in that distributed infrastructure, we were collecting those signals, and then we were applying analytics to understand whether there was a denial of service attack going on and how do you automate that, right? Which is why Splunk bought us, because Splunk is all about that kind of infrastructure management and how do I know when things are going wrong across my enterprise infrastructure. And so Rocana was applying machine learning to those machine generated signals, which now I'm at Nubix, right? And it's like, okay, we've got the WAN optimization piece, we've got containers, which is like VMs, we've got big data, which is Cloudera, and the last piece of the puzzle is sensors, which are the equivalent at the edge of a router or a firewall, right? It's generating a signal. It's not human based, right? It's collecting this data on a regular interval. And how do I take that data, correlate it with other signals, and try and understand in some kind of automated ML data science way what is happening and what action do I need to take?
What a great story in terms of how all of this converges to both your leadership journey at Nubix, but obviously your technology accomplishments there as well. So you founded Nubix in 2017 with your now CTO, Mike Gray. You already talked a little bit about the problem you set out to solve, but tell us about some of your key use cases and wins then.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of funny because that's a slight misnomer, is that I actually am not the original CEO of Nubix. So I am the cleanup crew. I came in when Nubix was basically kind of on its last leg, and I was put in as CEO by the board after about 2 or 3 months. So I came in as COO with the expectation I would succeed the old CEO, but it was kind of a 2 to 3 year track. Within 2 to 3 months, the board stepped in, put me in as CEO, and it has changed in so many ways. It's not even the same company anymore, right? So my original investor, he calls me the Phoenix, right? Because from the ashes, I have built Nubix, and it's, there's not a line of code left from what Nubix was before. But what I saw was the right kind of ideas, right? Is how do we bring intelligence in an agile, safe way to the edge of the industrial environment. And Mike and I, my CTO, my co-founder and I like to talk about, our experience in enterprise infrastructure and how the goal really was to take, how did the cloud and how did technology that was built to solve these problems in large distributed enterprise infrastructures, right? When I was a Windows NT network admin, I remember all the pain of, printers that wouldn't communicate and, I can't get to my email and why is this not working and what version of software is running on which servers and all of that kind of overhead. And now you've got the cloud, right? And I swipe my credit card and I'm up and running on an AWS EC2 instance in a couple of minutes, right? That is what needs to happen at the edge. And that's where Mike and I's background, right? Mike's much more services and databases and appliances and all of that on the tech side. And so it was this beautiful marriage of, services and IT infrastructure, and how do you bring those learnings to this edge environment? Because we saw that was the next wave, right? Is that industrial needed help starting to solve these problems. And so we brought those learnings from the cloud, but we we focused on what was true about the edge, right? It's small compute, it's disconnected, it's, hazardous or rugged environments that, have low power and all of these constraints. So how do you solve those problems in an edge native way, but using the same kind of concepts that make sense from, that journey for IT and cloud?
We interesting. I'm thinking of you as the stealth turnaround CEO now. The Phoenix, actually, that's a really good one to potentially subtitle this one as, which is great. We've talked about the in the past that. Industrial IoT, in some sense, we think is a way to describe the virtualization of OT, much as the virtualization of IT has happened over the last couple decades, and of course going all the way down to control levels. So so it's interesting to see how you've applied that from the enterprise IT side, to the industrial side. Now, the industrial side, of course, is very much about deterministic life safety, high resolution, if you will, control many times. And so you'll know we're active investors in companies like yourself, Edge Impulse, Mutable, all of which are providing edge, if you will, capabilities for various fashions. How do you think, when you think about edge computing relative to industrial IoT, how do you think it differs from versus, let's say, enterprise IT as an example, right? How do you design differently? How do you take to market differently for the industrial?
I love that question because it's one of my kind of key go-to phrases that I like to talk about, especially when I'm talking to investors or, senior business execs. And that is that, I think one of the reasons why this problem hasn't been solved, right? Because, GE Predix spent billions of dollars, right? And I have a very good friend that was a senior VP of product there. And if GE Predix couldn't solve it, like, what makes Nubix think that we, with our little band of merry men are going to go solve this? And I think one of the reasons why we've been successful in getting the traction we have and getting the attention we have is that we looked at what was already true about the edge, right? And we kind of accepted the reality of the edge, right? Like, a lot of people are like, hey, just, get a green grass device and slap it on there, get a GPU, right? But you think about an oil and gas rig that has 30,000 data collection points. And guess what? A lot of those, about 2/3 of those, are already a sensor connected to a microcontroller. There's compute there, right? It's not that there isn't compute. There are 1 trillion microcontrollers out in the world today. And I just got off the phone with ARM. They shipped another 4.4 billion microcontrollers last quarter, right? Like, it's only accelerating, right? So there's microcontrollers out there, but the answer for a lot of people is, well, we'll slap a GPU on it. You can't put 30,000 GPUs on an oil and gas rig, right? That's not even tenable from the perspective of the electricity consumption. So we really accepted the physics of the edge, right? Small devices, MCUs, right? We're talking 256K of RAM. Tiny, tiny devices. Maybe they have connectivity to the cloud. Maybe they don't. A lot of them don't, right? So they're disconnected environments. Maybe they don't even have anything but satellite that goes over once or twice a day, right? They are maybe on solar or battery, right? So these devices come on, read a couple things, turn on a light, and then turn back off, right? So there just were a lot of things about the edge that are so different than enterprise, where I expect to have always connected, unlimited compute. Anything I want is kind of at my fingertips, right? This kind of like lavish existence in the cloud of like overconsumption, over compute, anything I want. It's kind of gluttonous, but way out at the edge, it's like sub-Saharan Africa, right? Where you're like, eking out whatever you can on these little tiny devices. And so Nubix really accepted the edge, right, based on what was already there, so that we could address all of that brownfield opportunity. It's going to take time, right? But we really focused on how do we leverage the compute and the connectivity and the power and everything that already exists out there to to be able to address those. And then as, greenfield stuff comes online and there's more opportunity there, that's also addressable. And it's kind of this, bringing it all up together and bringing it all online into one platform instead of, ignoring the trillion microcontrollers that are already out there. And that's where we come up with this edge native idea, right? You've got cloud native technology that totally makes sense in an unlimited compute, unlimited power world. But out at the edge where you're in edge native territory, you really need technology that was purpose built for what exists at the edge.
So let's drill down a little bit and go back, if you will, on the use case example. Let's take the oil rig example that you have. How would somebody actually utilize you in that? Where you see the largest impact of what Nubix is able to bring into into an example like that?
Well, so let's talk about heat sensors, right? So let's say, if an oil and gas rig, let's say out of those 30,000 data collection points, let's say a couple hundred of those devices are heat sensors, right? And they're managing all kinds of different pieces of equipment. And maybe some collection of those needs to have one particular algorithm applied to the data signal, right? So I've got a sensor, I've got maybe a microcontroller, most likely 2/3 of the time, there's gonna be a microcontroller attached to that. Right now, that microcontroller is kind of like old phones, right? Before smartphones came along, where, I can turn a light on or off, maybe I can shut something down, or maybe I can turn on a fan, but it's pretty limited in my ability to address the situation, make sense of the data that's coming off of that sensor in a meaningful way, right? I may turn the light on and say, hey, I've got an alert, something's overheating. But I, as the operator, am now going to have to go on a journey to figure out, why is this light on? What is overheating? Why is it overheating, right? If instead, using Nubix, once I've installed Nubix as my container on those heat sensors, now I can deploy analytics that are very specific, right? To understand this data signal, maybe even correlate it with, not just the heat sensor. Now I'm going to correlate the heat sensor signal with a vibration sensor signal, or maybe a humidity, right? Or some kind of friction, right? And then I can start to make sense of what's happening. And, and step one is maybe not to take action. Maybe step one is to inform the actual operators of, hey, yes, the heat sensor has an issue, but I can actually tell you what the issue is now, right? And then as people get comfortable, right, because you got to kind of walk before you can run, as people get comfortable, the goal is to get to the point where now I trust that interpretation of the data and understanding what's actually happening. Now I can actually take action, right, and let the machines start to be autonomous. And that's all really hard to do, because across those heat sensors, they're going to be all kinds of different OEMs, different communications protocols, different chipsets. Right now, what that looks like is every time I want to update one of those sensors, I'm doing everything in C and C++. It's slow. I've got to design an application for each individual incantation of that set of, parameters, right? What's the RTOS? What's the chip? What's the board? What's the communications protocol? What's my I2C bus setting, right? So those are all the things that make that really hard. And so what you see is those firmware devices just don't get updated, right? Schneider updates them once every 6 months, and ABB didn't touch them in 9 months, right? Because it's just too hard. And then we haven't even talked about the potential of bricking those devices, right? And that's going to become more and more front and center as you see things like the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. Now, that was on the financials, right? But the hackers are seeing that these edge infrastructures are great targets because this firmware, these MCUs, are just very vulnerable, right, based on kind of current technology stacks. And that has to get addressed, right, across water treatment facilities and street lights and, nuclear facilities and things. That's the next kind of infrastructure issue that is pending for our country and for the world. And it starts at these MCUs where the sensors are.
Truly industrial edge in that regard. We have a investment thesis called "Brown is the new green," i.e., brownfield is where all the money's at.
Yep.
Show me a greenfield in the industrial IoT for the most part, right? They're very
Yeah.
rare, and
Yep.
even then, because it's probably the same corporate owner, they're going to replicate what they already have volume purchasing agreements in all the other plants with, right? So
Absolutely.
it's a way of perpetrating, if you will, or perpetualizing, just legacy, right? And
Yep.
so it's an interesting model, and I see your value proposition very clearly in terms of how you guys help, if you will, both homogenize and then harmonize all of that together. So, I like this people topic. So let me go back for a moment. I think I was joking with you before the podcast that, if fortune tellers were accurate, they should be by definition the richest people in the world, right? Because they can fortune tell everything. And in some sense, exec search professionals, recruiting professionals, should be the best, if you will, at identifying and recruiting and retaining really key talent. So I'm curious, as a CEO, and clearly the term the Phoenix goes a long ways here, but what has been your experience in that regard, right? Do you feel like because of your background, you've been a better, people leader and recruiter and retainer of talent?
Well, I mean, I think you'd have to talk to the people who report to me as to whether I'm a good people leader. I mean, I try really hard, right? I'm very, very focused on, culture and authenticity. And the biggest one is, mean what you say, do what you say, and mean what you say, right? Like, don't say one thing and do something else. Like, it makes everybody mad, right? And it never goes well. So, but, a couple of lessons I learned along the way, like one of the companies I was at was backed by Khosla, and Vinod's, his admonition to the CEO was, no matter what, you spend 25% of your time as a CEO on people, right? Whether that's recruiting, managing, mentoring, whatever it is, right? And that really stuck with me, right? That even at the CEO level, back then, right, and this would have been 15 years ago, that it was that important, right, from his perspective. And then I think the other thing that really stuck with me, and I saw over and over and over again done wrong, and you see it in books, is that number one regret most CEOs have is not dealing with a people issue when it's time to get somebody out of the organization. And I saw that firsthand. I mean, I saw a company completely implode at, 65 people because of one bad people choice that just did not get addressed. And so that's something that, and my team, I think, would say that the thing that they see about me is that as much as I love people and as important as people are, I'm also absolutely fearless in the face of the hard choices. You have to be willing to make the hard choices, which sometimes sucks, right, in the moment. But a great hire is absolutely as important as knowing when it's time to get somebody out of the organization. So it's really that balance, right? And it takes constant attention, right, to the signals, right, across my people of what's working, what's not working, and that's the only way you keep good talent, right? So we've hired two amazing engineers, and I love the fact that we're so efficient, right? Like Mike interviewed like two people, put one in front of me. We hired him. He's been phenomenal. For the other position, I think he interviewed 5 people, put 2 in front of me. We hired one, and he's been phenomenal, right? Like the amount of overhead to find awesome people, but then actually get them to stick and be productive, like, is so low here. And, and I have a great network to pull from because I have a great reputation of having made the right choices, right? Like, early on in my career as a recruiter, I realized even if I had a fee attached to making a hire, if it was the wrong hire, I would talk people out of it, right? On either side, right? The candidate or the company, I'd say, nope, this is not the right person. Like, yeah, I'm going to walk away from a $10,000 fee, but it's the right choice long-term. And I built my reputation on those kinds of choices. And so I think all of that comes through and makes the job of hiring and building an awesome team actually really easy. It's not as hard as it seems like it is for a lot of other people, but it's because I think I try and head off those challenges early on and then deal with them swiftly when they do rear their head.
I think, as you referred to it before the podcast, you called it your superpower, which is apropos. Well,
Yes.
speaking of your other superpower, one we're very proud to be behind a woman founder especially in this deep tech space. But sadly, women still remain very underrepresented as founders of tech companies. I guess, to what do you owe, or attribute your success, and probably more importantly, what would you advise to other women following in your footsteps?
I'll go back to, the fact that this has not been a direct path, right? There was no layup here. There was no clearly defined, point A to point B. There was no straight line. But I think that I was tenacious, right? I love what one of my mentors, who's a Stanford professor in the business school over there, says, and that is try another play. Right. So I think that mentality of, being passionate, knowing what you want, not giving up, trying another play, constantly tacking and looking for that opening and that opportunity is all what is required to be able to sit in the seat I'm in now. Right. Like, one of my investors, his comment is that I wish that more of my CEOs had 10% of the gut instinct, but the willingness to trust and be passionate and focused and convicted, but still willing to constantly take in new information and adjust, right? Like, so not blindly, right? Committed. And that is really hard. It's hard to nail that and thread that needle, because you have to believe in yourself, but have enough humility to not have what I like to call happy ears, right? Where I've already made up my mind, this is the path. And no matter how many signals come in telling you that's not going to work, you just continue blindly forward. It's hard to nail that right. And I think for women, it is an amazing set of skills if you're willing to stick with it and not get discouraged and continue to believe in yourself. Even when they say that being the CEO is the loneliest job, I like to say being the female CEO, especially in tech, is definitely the loneliest job. And but you've got to be able to stand in that and be comfortable with that and continue on. And eventually, it'll work out if you don't give up, right? You always find your keys in the last place you look, because, well, hopefully you stop looking, but once you found them, but like, you can't give up, right? You just have to keep finding a way, trying another play.
Well said. And I guess today we call it just pivoting, right?
Oh,
Try
gosh.
another play. Yeah, pivot.
Right. I don't know. I feel like VCs think that's a bad word, so I try not to use that word. It seems to make everybody scared. So.
All right, there you go, Phoenix.
Right. Right.
Well, finally, I always like to close out these conversations with just understanding how you find your personal inspiration as well, especially being the loneliest person in the Bay Area, I guess, at this point. So.
I am a voracious Audible reader. And my playlist is everything from, organizational development and people management to my undergrad, actually, funny enough, is in psych, right? So I love understanding humans and brains and how they work and technology and, organizational structure and go-to-market forces. So I listen to a million books on Audible any chance I get when I'm doing anything that doesn't require that kind of passive listening. And that's, I'd say, probably my number one place that I look for help kind of sorting through and making choices and understanding how to approach things. And then I also, one of the people at Momenta has become a really great kind of, peer and confidant. So finding people that you trust that have the same values has been really helpful for me to, just to have some kind of, tribe, right? I'd say is the other half of my kind of inspiration, right? Find smart people who, look at the world in a really smart way and, be willing to take feedback and be wrong and listen and do a lot more listening than talking. And I just try and really pay attention. All right. It's funny because before Nubix, which is now all sensor based, I used to make the joke that, my antenna goes all the way up. And I definitely feel that way now. Like I've got a lot of sensors and I just am always kind of looking for the signal, right, that helps me navigate the next step in the journey.
Well said. I really like that. That's although I've got images of the old, what was it? My Favorite Martian.
Right, exactly.
The little
That's
antennas
exactly
popping up.
right. And the little like static electricity signal going between the two. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now we've just dated both of ourselves. So
Right. That's okay.
yeah, exactly. This was pre-Netflix for all of you younger generation.
Right.
So, well, Rachel, look, thank you for spending this time with us today.
Thank you. It's been awesome. I really enjoyed it. We should have done it sooner, Ken.
We absolutely should have, and you put so many notable quotables in the first couple questions there that I think there's plenty of room and opportunity to deep dive on some of those in the future talks. So I greatly appreciate you taking the time. So this has been Rachel Taylor, CEO of Nubix, and if I can get away with it, AKA the Phoenix, because I think it's absolutely a good description for you. Thank you for listening, and please join us next week for our next Momenta Digital Thread podcast. Thank you and have a great day. You've been listening to the Momenta Digital Thread podcast series. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and as always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please check our website at momenta.one for archive versions of podcasts, as well as resources to help with your digital industry journey. Thank you for listening.